Mang, Programs Coordinator at the Wattis Institute. I'm very pleased to present to you Triple Candie's co-founders and directors Shelly Bancroft and Peter Nesbett. Triple Candie opened its doors in 2001 in Harlem as a nonprofit art space. After 4 years exhibiting both established and emerging artists, Triple Candie adopted a more radical idea of curating and producing exhibitions about art, but largely devoid of it and realized without the involvement of artists. Typically, these exhibitions consist of reproductions, surrogates, models, stage sets, or common objects, displayed using a combination of rhetorical devices borrowed from history, museums, and community art galleries. Some of the exhibitions in this vein were the unofficial retrospectives of artists David Hammons, Cady Noland, and Maurizio Cattelan. Triple Candie's primary purpose since 2005 has been to explore the possibilities of exhibition making as a distinct and truly alternative practice. Although currently a placeless gallery, Triple Candie continues producing exhibitions for other venues under the same operating principles. The latest episode of its adventurous life was the abrupt cancellation of a show commissioned by Artissima for this year's edition of the Turin-based Contemporary Art Fair, about which we will hear more tonight.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. Before we get started, just wanted to thank a few people for inviting us out to speak and for their hospitality during our stay. Jens Hoffman, director of the Wattis Institute, is one. Also at the Wattis, we'd like to thank Claire Fitzsimmons, deputy director, and Mickey Mang, program coordinator. Late this afternoon, we also had the opportunity and the pleasure to spend a few hours with a dozen students here. We'd like to thank them as well as Lee Markopoulos, director of the graduate program and curating at the CCA, for that opportunity.
This evening, rather than give a standard overview of Triple Candie's work, we're going to do something a little bit different and just ever so slightly more dramatic. We are going to conduct an informal reading of a script we wrote specifically for you. The title is The Italian Job.
This title refers to the title of a feature film released in 1969, a comic caper about British professional thieves stealing a shipment of gold in downtown Turin. The heist more or less unfolds as planned until the ebullient thieves try to make their way over the Italian Alps and they crash their bus, losing the gold off the side of a cliff.
Our story involves two characters. One is Triple Candie, the alternative art space that we started in Harlem in 2001. The two of us will be the voice of Triple Candie. The other is Artissima, a contemporary art fair based in Turin. Jens Hoffman will be reading the part of Artissima. The story takes place in Philadelphia. The scene is a small two-story house where we, as Triple Candie and our cat, Pops, currently reside. The events are real, and the dialogue is factual.
The story starts early on a Monday morning last May. We got up, had breakfast, and checked our email, where we found a message from a Francesca Bertolotti, a name we didn't recognize. The email read,
I have the pleasure to write you to start a conversation about a possible collaboration between you and Artissima, the International Fair of Contemporary Art in Torino, as we are in the process of developing the curatorial project of its next edition, taking place in November. This year we are trying to construct a new kind of institution or museum in a special section at the fair. It will include all the sections, departments, and activities of a standard contemporary art museum, but each of them will play on some kind of twist. A different organization, projects, and curators will be involved to reinvent and articulate on the solo show, the permanent collection, the educational department, the souvenir shop, and so on. We have been talking about the curatorial experimentations that you have carried out at Triple Candie in terms of the practice of reenactment and accessibility.
As we read the email, we noticed that the way our work was characterized was slightly inaccurate, but we continued reading.
As well as freedom from authorship, and in terms of your focus on the relationship between the value of the art object, the material, and its documentation. With this in mind, we would like to invite you to take part in our project and think of a possible way to reinvent the group show. Basically, we would like this occasion to be an opportunity for you to further the experiment you started with such shows as Cady Noland, David Hammons, Maurizio Cattelan, Beavers and Weavers as non-believers. We would be thrilled if you accepted our proposal and if you could think about a project for our temporary museum in a fair.
We were, of course, flattered, but also skeptical. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Triple Candie, we should put this email that we received in context.
Over the past decade, during a period of art fair mania, when nonprofits started exhibiting regularly at art fairs, Triple Candie remained willfully apart. Triple Candie never participated in an art fair. We've categorically refused to. We've also come to see the gallery's program as inseparable from both its facilities as well as from the neighborhoods in which the shows are presented. To participate in something as placeless as an international art fair made no sense to us. We asked ourselves, how familiar is Artissima with our program?
We also asked ourselves, do you think they understand the challenge of presenting a Triple Candie show?
And do they know what we've been through, and that we've been through this before? In 2006, the Palais de Tokyo in Paris wanted to present one of our exhibitions, the Unauthorized Retrospective on the art of the reclusive and enigmatic David Hammons. The exhibition consisted of 100 photocopies and computer printouts of the artist's work, many quite degenerated, affixed with black gaffer's tape to plywood panels. The curator at the Palais, a man named Anthony Huberman, had seen the show in Harlem and was very excited about it. We reminded him of the institutional challenge of mounting a show against an artist's wishes or without his approval, but he pressed on.
We spent 3 months in back-and-forth discussions. Our biggest concern was that key motivations for us producing the show in Harlem would not translate in Paris. After much thought, we decided on our end that the exhibition would need to take the form of an historic recreation. We would recreate a 6,000 square foot replica of our brick-walled space with an adjacent or gallery containing documentation and ephemera pertaining to the original Harlem production. In the end, the conversations, the enthusiasm, the goodwill were all for naught. Huberman went to his boss, Marc-Olivier Waller, for final permission, and Waller decided that he, as the director, needed to get Hammons' permission. That ended the exploration. We parted ways with the Palais de Tokyo with no hard feelings.
The email we received from Artissima arrived 6 months after we had closed our Harlem space and had moved to Philadelphia. Though we'd recently done projects in museums in France and the U.S., in the interim, the offer to do a full exhibition was enticing. So we hoped for the best and decided to pursue the conversation and see where it led. We emailed back and said we would send a proposal. Several weeks later, on June 23rd, we sent Francesca Bertolotti a proposal for a group show based on the now well-known export shows organized by MoMA in collaboration with the United States Information Agency in the 1950s and 60s. However, rather than celebrate American artistic achievement abroad, as those exhibitions did, our show would present the work of 4 to 6 overhyped U.S. artists. The artists we suggested included Cory Archangel, Talbot Auerbach, Peter Coffin, Dan Colin, Nate Lohman, Julie Meritou, Richard Prince, Josh Smith, and Michelane Thomas, and so on.
The exhibition, like all of our shows, would have consisted of art surrogates, not the artist's actual work. We would exhibit reproductions with elaborate wall labels. The texts would address the conceptual and technical weaknesses of the work on view and explain why the objects and the artist had become so collectible, in our opinion, at least. In criticizing U.S. culture in Italy, we were playing off a long history of distrust by Italians about American influences in their country, in addition to the U.S. shows, the USIA shows.
We cited as preference as a precedence, in addition to the USIA shows, for which there's a catalog here. We also cited Hitler's degenerate art show in Munich in 1937.
And Joseph Kussoth's 1990 Brooklyn Museum show titled The Play of the Unmentionable as Touchstones.
On June 29th, Artissima responded. The email was from Francesco Manacorda, Artissima's new young director.
After a long discussion about radicality in the market, We got to the conclusion that given the context of the fair, a show about artists who have been receiving undue attention may be slightly problematic, considering that most of the artists you mention are presented by galleries at the fair. We hope you understand we would rather not be so extremely critical towards the galleries and the artists that make up the fair.
Artissima asked us to submit another idea. 2 weeks later, we submitted 3 proposals, all with arte povera as their subject.
Probably most of you are familiar with arte povera, but we imagine some might not be. Arte povera, which translates literally as poor art, is a term coined by the critic curator Germano Chalant, initially to describe the work of a handful of artists working in Italy, principally in Turin, who substituted primary experiences for mediated representations, and who avoided a singular style. Chalant adopted the idea of poor art from the theater, specifically from the Polish director Jerzy Grotowski, whose poor theater was an attempt to par the medium back to its essential elements, one of which was a direct relationship to the spectator. In 1967, Chalant launched Arte Povera with a manifesto in the pages of Flash Art, characterizing it as a guerrilla movement that was intended to celebrate the free will of the individual in a society increasingly dominated by what he called the system. Almost overnight, the movement was celebrated as the most important art movement in Italy since Futurism, more than 50 years earlier.
We selected Arte Povera as a subject because we knew that in the fall of 2011, it would receive a major redress in Italy. No fewer than 5 exhibitions were to open with Chalant as co-curator in Naples, Rome, Bologna, Milan, and Turin. Explaining the 3 options to Artissima, we wrote,
in the first, we would focus on Arte Povera's chronic redefinition, resurrection, and regurgitation over the past 40 years. We'd present it as a schizophrenic patient, a fluid subject that has long overflowed its bucket. We'd look at curatorial and critical redefinitions, as well as recuperations of Arte Povera's aesthetic by contemporary artists outside of the movement who had turned its so-called anti-capitalist dirt into gold. In the second, we would try to make a case that Arte Povera never existed. Dan Cameron made this claim in a bold article in Flash Art in 1992. We will build on this with an earnest tone and a mischievous spirit. The subject could be dealt with the way skeptics tried to disprove the existence of stories in the Bible, with material evidence, such as documentation of artworks and exhibitions. The design will evoke that of a small town history or anthropological museum. The third idea is for a show devoted to Arte Povera that included none of the Italian artists, only the Americans and the Europeans that Chalant included in his 1969 Arte Povera book.
A week passed before we received an email response from Artissima.
Looking at your proposals, we believe that number 2 may be the strongest, wittiest, and most interesting viewpoint on the matter. At the same time, though, building on the statement that Arte Povera never existed may very well be seen by both art professionals and Turin citizens and officials as somewhat aggressive response to Germano Chalant's exhibition. Also, talking of Arte Povera in Turin, as you already know, is always kind of risky. Everyone is an expert in Turin, at the same time that real experts in Arte Povera will surely be in Turin for the show.
On July 24th, we wrote a lengthy response, including an attempt to convince Manicorda that our project wasn't meant to be aggressive or even strictly irreverent. We wrote,
people have at times used the word irreverent when talking about Triple Candie. On the surface, our shows may appear to be irreverent. They are done without permission, don't use art, often have provocative titles, but the narrative substance of the show is never irreverent. Our wall texts always evidence a certain admiration for our subjects. When choosing our subjects, we select those for which we have an enthusiastic ambivalence and which have had a complicated influence on our own curatorial practice. The process of putting together the show is an attempt to work through these issues. We didn't select Arte Povera simply because of its relationship to Turin. Equally important, we selected it as a topic because of its relationship to our work.
Before we proceed further into our story, it might make some sense right now to take a quick detour into Triple Candie's work and history. We received our nonprofit business license in 2001 on September 12th, to be exact, the day after the 9/11 attacks, and opened in December on 126th Street. For the first 4 years, we presented group exhibitions that mixed the work of established and emerging artists, as well as ambitious solo projects of unshown talent.
This is an exhibition we curated that looked at contemporary wall hangings. In the center, you can see the work of Jim Hodges. On the far right is a piece by Trenton Doyle Hancock. There are also works by Tracy Emin, Rosie Lee Tompkins, and others. This was Brian Jungen's solo show debut in New York, shortly after his residency here at the Wattis, and about 2 years before his survey at the New Museum. The exhibition is a single installation comprised of 242 sewing tables with the machines removed and assembled into a basketball court. We curated about 35 solo and group exhibitions at this time.
In late 2005, frustrated in our attempts to compete against a red-hot market for artists' attention, we changed our programming completely. We began making exhibitions about art, but largely devoid of it, and almost always without the involvement of artists. The David Hammons show that we've already mentioned was the first. 2 months later, we produced a related show that consisted exclusively of unauthorized sculptural recreations of an equally reclusive and controlling artist's work.
The show was titled Cady Noland Approximately, Editions and Sculptures, 1984 to 1999. It consisted of 13 sculptural surrogates made largely from scavenged and donated materials and based on images of Noland's work found solely on the internet. The works were neither accurate nor, we assume, installed in a manner that Noland would have liked. Noland was a rising star in the art world in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and dropped out suddenly in 1993. There had never been a monograph published on her work. This show is the first survey, however, in a mediated form.
In 2009, 2 years before the current show at the Guggenheim, we presented a survey on Maurizio Cattelan. Titled Maurizio Cattelan Is Dead, Life and Work, 1960 to 2009, it was presented as both the first and last word on the artist who, arguably more than any other, represented the degrees to which artists could find instant, near overnight success in the 90s and 2000s. It was Cattelan's first retrospective. Our history includes 2 other shows of relevance to tonight's story. The first is El Museo de Reproducciones Fotográficas.
El Museo is a lending collection of some 1,200 images cut from our personal art books. In 2010, we donated the entire collection to the D'Este Foundation in Athens, which now maintains it as a lending collection. Another is the Matthew Higgs Society. From 2006 until 2010, we maintained a living archive on the life and work of Matthew Higgs, a curator-writer who's director of White Columns in New York and was a curator here at the Wattis about a decade ago. We presented selections from the archive in a reading room that we constructed especially for it.
But back to Philadelphia. Before touching on Triple Candie's history, we were talking about Artissima's concerns about the local response to our proposal. We addressed this in an email to Francesco Manacorda. We wrote,
as for the show being seen as somewhat as an aggressive response to Chalant's show, we want to say a few things about context. The first is that the show will be publicly accessible for less than a week, making it but fleeting. Second, the fact that it would be placed in a provisional fake museum context would, we imagine, enhance the absurdity of our claim that arte povera never existed. Moreover, it would be but one of many projects within the spectacle of the art fair itself. Manacorda responded the following day.
I have to say that your email convinced me that we should really take the risk and embrace your project. We have invited you precisely because of the shows that you used as examples of situations in which people could have been offended, Hammons above all, with the great result we all know.
Later in the email, he said,
I totally believe that your approach will generate a great show and a very valuable contribution to the rest of the project. I only suggest, since the difficult character of the artist here in Turin, that we touch base every now and then on how the idea is developing so that we can give you some feedback which eventually you can decide to ignore. In short, we trust you and like your idea a lot.
We began research and production on July 29th. First, we purchased and studied the major English language texts and press on Arte Povera. Then we traveled to Bard College's Center for Curatorial Studies to look through everything we couldn't buy online.
In our research, we quickly realized that in addition to Dan Cameron's original article, which characterized the movement as a marketing scheme, there is considerable confusion and doubt among historians and curators as to what exactly Arte Povera was and is. Chellant has played a key role in fostering this confusion. From the first exhibition in Genoa and Turin of 1967 to the 1968 weekend-long exhibition in Amalfi, Chellant's definition of Arte Povera changes considerably. So too did the artists he associates with, expanding from a half a dozen Italians to include a handful of Europeans. By 1970, he expands the cast even further, absorbing Americans like Richard Serra and Bruce Nauman into its fold. Then suddenly, in 1971, frustrated by the fact that many of the original core artists were not adhering to his radical anti-market characterization of their work, Chellant declares the movement finished, done, dead. He leaves Italy, moves to LA, and goes on to other projects. But Chellant is not done.
In the early 1980s, he returns to Arte Povera again, curating major exhibitions in Europe and the US on the subject. To this day, he remains actively committed to its historization. When we returned to Philadelphia, we began cutting images out of our Arte Povera books, altering them and arranging them in groups on the walls in the hallway of our house. We were looking at the work in relationship to the various texts written about it. We were also looking for ways of inserting our voice into the mythology of a movement that was, from the start, a fiction. As we were working, Artissima emailed us a contract, which we signed. Several weeks later, Manicorda invited us to participate in another project outside of the art fair, a special issue magazine to be published by the Turin-based collector and dealer Giorgio Maffei on the subject of the movement. In writing about Maffei and his publishing partner, Manicorda noted,
they really liked the idea to have a section of their book on Arte Povera attempting to argue that Arte Povera does not exist.
Good news. Maffei is an authority on the subject. We then turn our attention to the design of the show.
Here is a drawing of the special section at the fair that was to be the fake museum that we were given for our space. We thought it would be good to divide it up into a series of galleries, each with a different function. The overall plan was based on a quickly scrawled X.
On September 12th, when the Artissima catalog deadline arrived, we submitted our statement with sample images. We grounded our argument against the existence of Arte Povera in verificationalism, a philosophy related to empiricism. Manicorda responded via email.
I just read the text. I like it a lot. It is tough on Chellant, but very relevant and balanced.
Manicorda accepted the text for publication. It read,
there is no Arte Povera. It never existed, as we determined from the evidence, which is unreliable and contradictory. If we were Italian, we might have witnessed it. Our eyes, our hands, our noses, maybe even our ears. But we were born in America in the 1960s, and so we have to rely on documents, artifacts, and eyewitness accounts. And these are unreliable, contradictory. We don't believe them. We don't believe Chellant. His story has changed too many times. The movement existed from 1967 to 1971. The movement existed from 1967 to 1975. It ended a long time ago. It continues today. Arte Povera is Chalant's creation, his myth, and he will write it until his death. He is a hero. We don't believe the other curators and historians that make revisions, corrections. They contaminate the scene. They alter the evidence. They include Piero Gilardi and Marissa Mertz. They remove Gianni Picciantonio. Their arguments can be argued. Arte Povera is the shroud of Italy. It cannot be proved. It did not exist.
On September 15th, we talked with Manacorda and Francesca Bertolotti, his project manager, via Skype. We updated them about our progress in detail and answered their questions about intent. Overall, the tone of the exchange was very positive. At the end of the call, Manacorda expressed concern about a copyright issue. He said he was worried that the fair could be sued for the unauthorized use of images. He brought up image selection for the catalog and said that he was only comfortable in publishing the images that we have altered, as opposed to the ones that were simply cut out. He then asked if we would agree to a joint statement to be kept on file that described the exhibition as a single artwork, so that if someone sued the fair for an unauthorized use of some photograph, he could claim that the use was legitimate, as it was but a small element in a much larger work. We didn't consider the exhibition or its contents to be artwork, but we did see the exhibition as a singular entity. We agreed to his request. 10 days later, he emailed us an updated description. 10 days later, we emailed him an updated description of the installation, including sample images. Manacorda responded immediately. He was nervous.
Thank you for sending the description of your installation. As I mentioned at the beginning of our collaboration, I think we are walking on eggshells with this project, and I would like to make sure to avoid misunderstandings of your intentions. I have worked, and still now work, with many of the protagonists of the movement, and I would like them to look at your project not just as a parody.
Manacorda's use of the word parody we interpreted as a red flag. We continued developing the exhibition.
The entry gallery would contain a lengthy wall text that laid out our argument and made clear that our show was about Arte Povera, but that it was not a show of Arte Povera work. A timeline would lead the visitor into the next gallery. This timeline was to map the ever-evolving way the movement had been defined from 1967 to the present. Take the example of the show co-curated by the Walker Art Museum and Tate Museum in 2001. Its title, Zero to Infinity, Arte Povera, 1962 to 1972. 1962? 1972? In the second gallery, the visitor would find a display of photo reproductions grouped in clusters. They were to be a mix of works associated with the movement at one time or another and photos of the artists. The images were to be presented without reference to year, artist, or material. We curated them using our own aesthetic criteria.
Leaving the second gallery that contained this cluster, which is visible at the bottom of the screen, the viewer would pass along a wall of posters on an angled wall on their way to the main gallery. These posters were museum gift shop-like portraits of 14 of the Italian artists strongly identified with Arte Povera. In the main gallery, Gallery 3, in the center of the model, the viewer would find a dense array of props or surrogate sculptures based, like the flatworks, on seminal works affiliated with the movement. And again, all were to be presented without attribution and without even reference to the originals. We plan to exhibit a surrogate of this 1968 piece by Luciano Fabbro, titled by him, 3 Ways to Put the Sheets. Here is our surrogate. There was to be a similarly wrong recreation of a well-known untitled 1969 work by Janis Kounelis. The original consists of 36 stones, each of which is painted half black. The surrogate would instead consist of 36 stones that were to be painted half white. Giovanni Anselmo has, over the years, recreated this epic sculpture from 1968, using granite, lettuce, sometimes dirt. We had planned to make our own iterations of the original, using lettuce, other vegetables, but also meat. And there would be a surrogate of a Mario Mertz igloo that combined aspects from a number of his different igloo pieces into a single bastardized object.
The fourth gallery would look nothing like the others. It was to be dedicated, without perceived irony, to the extraordinary and unarguable achievements of Germano Chalant. It would take the form of a small-town history museum. There would have been a wall of Chalant's publications, or rather, book surrogates, not the actual books, a desk with a computer, posters and pictures, a tabletop model of the Guggenheim Museum where Chalant is an adjunct curator. It would be similar in feel to our Matthew Higgs Society.
We received another email from Manicorda.
From this side of the Atlantic, I'm preparing a bit the terrain by talking to the directors at Rivoli, where the Cattelan show is about to open, and with the press to put forward the reasons to make your project happen. How does it sound to you? Would it be possible to send some more detailed plans of install? It is not my intention to intrude into your authorship, obviously, so do let me know if I'm pushing it too much.
Before we could respond, he wrote again.
I've spoken to Beatrice Merz, who is the co-director of Rivoli and co-curator with Cattelan of the exhibition, and she expressed worries as recently a prominent right-wing art critic published an article in a national newspaper to demonstrate that Arte Povera was a bad movement made by communists who prevented the art scene to flourish in this country. I would really be gutted if your show were to be associated to this anti-intellectual campaign that is trying to destroy the contemporary art system in Italy.
On September 27th, we emailed Artissima an extensive update on the show, including additional photographs of the gallery model, more two-dimensional works, the quotes for a series of vinyl wall texts, and the posters for the portrait wall. Here are 4 of the texts for the quotes. The first is by Bettina Ruhrberg, a museum director in Germany.
It was not clear which artists and works could be described as the products of Arte Povera, nor what distinguished their works from each other and what they had in common. And it was similarly unclear whether the term should be understood in terms of style, of an epic, a group phenomena, or something completely different.
The second was a quote by Giuseppe Pannone, the youngest of the artists affiliated with Arte Povera, which stated,
Arte Povera isn't actually the name of a group. And what's more, the progress and the history of the artists involved in it were very different.
A quote by Michelangelo Pistoletto, who was a generation older.
We do not belong to, are not a part of, and do not accept the term Arte Povera.
And finally, a quote from Pino Pascali, an artist who died in 1968 in a motorcycle accident at the height of things.
For me, these are fake sculptures. I'm interested in seeing this sort of farce that the exhibition is.
Here are 4 of the 14 posters we designed for the poster wall. We couldn't yet send Artissima images of the 3-dimensional objects, as we stated earlier, because they were to be constructed on site in Turin when we arrived. On September 28th, Manicorda wrote,
Sorry for not having acknowledged the email. I'm about to have a meeting to discuss this issue and will get back to you shortly.
What issue, we asked, growing suspicious. Manicorda answered,
I mean the risk that the institution and I would take.
What has changed vis-a-vis your perception of the risk? As we're several months down the road, and you have been enthusiastic and supportive of the project all along, from original proposal through updates and the catalog contribution, from where we sit, the risk is only dialogue. What's risky about that? This is not an offensive subject like pornography, blasphemy, anti-Semitism, racism, etc. The subject is the construction and definition of an art movement.
Manicorda emailed a list of questions that would take many hours to answer. We sensed that he was now so concerned about the show that he was simply trying to find a way to cancel it. Before answering his questions, we wrote,
More soon, but do you really think that our exhibition can negatively impact government funding on the arts in Italy and potentially threaten the viability of Artissima? Is the risk truly that great?
I would not put it down in writing otherwise. It is not the show that will generate the funding cut, but the situation in which we are can be precipitated by an event such as this one.
We responded to Manicorda's questions, though we were already aware that the Q&A was but an exercise, and that it would have little effect on his hardening position. Most of the questions had been previously discussed in the Skype meeting. Resentful of this obligation and unwilling to play this game, we provided short, mostly one-sentence answers. The first question read,
What are the reasons behind altering the images of the works? Is it a parody, or is there a more complex narrative behind? What role do they play in the development of your argument about the non-existence of arte povera?
To which we answered,
The evidence is unreliable and contradictory.
Why are the portraits altered? Has this got to do with individual versus group, or is that a visualization of the author's identity blurring with the work?
The evidence is unreliable and contradictory.
Do the alterations enter within the core of this arte povera theme, example given energy, materials, process, and how?
Yes and no.
What is the rationale behind the altered surrogates as a group, given that people can see the original in the museum, which wasn't the case in many of your previous projects? Is the alteration the key to the remaking? I'm asking you this as the piece could be understood by the general public as real sculptures rather than surrogates. In case this is part of your plan, how do you handle this potential misunderstanding? Do you think that the public will be able to understand the reasons for this alteration?
Yes, we tell them in wall texts. This will be a problem for the illiterate, of course.
What is the historical conclusion that you presume the viewers would gain from experiencing your show?
History is the provenance of doubt. Experience is all we can trust. Everything else is built from shards of misrepresentation.
Chenald himself declared that arte povera does not exist in 1972 and encouraged individual artists to pursue their own solo career. How is your argument different from this position?
He said it was finished. He didn't say it did not exist. Chaland's argument is unreliable and contradictory.
How is your thesis that arte povera never existed demonstrated throughout the show?
The evidence is unreliable and contradictory.
We did not hear from Manicorda right away. Nearly a week passed before,
due to the potential offense, we need to make sure that your project is able to have the critical weight to stand up to them. Otherwise, we will all look foolish, and I mean all of us. It has not only to do with my situation.
Gee, that's nice, but he needn't worry about us.
The altered portraits and representation of their work that you sent me could make the project be judged here as a superficial joke on them. This is because in New York the context is characterized by a sophisticated art world able to understand and accustomed to art world parody. In Italy, the public barely knows what arte povera is.
but we thought you said a while back that everyone in Italy is an expert.
In Italy, the public barely knows what arte povera is, and they are likely to think that your project is bad taste, that it is ridiculing the movement in billing Triple Candie's work to be a one-liner.
Okay, we thought. We are confused. We found it hard to imagine that a public unaware of arte povera would visit the art fair in the first place, and if they did, how could they consider the show to be in bad taste if they didn't even recognize the subject?
Manicorda, we were convinced, was most nervous about offending Chalant and those heavily invested in the movement, financially speaking. We remembered his extreme change in tone after talking to Beatrice Merz, who is among the most invested in Italy. Beatrice Merz is the daughter of the arte povera artist Mario Merz and Marisa Merz. She runs her parents' foundation. She is the co-director of the Castello di Rivoli, which has large holdings of arte povera work. And professionally, She is close to Chalant. Later that night, we visited Artissima's website and noticed that it had been updated. Detailed information about the fake museum, which was to include our exhibition, had been added. There were descriptions of all the projects except ours. We emailed Artissima for an explanation. Early the next morning, on October 5th, we awoke to an email from Anacorta. Our show had been canceled.
Comments? Contradictions? Evidence?
Your question was, we'd done projects in other countries before this, and why did those work out and this one didn't? Is that what you were saying? Well, actually, the Palais de Tokyo show didn't work out. I think it was, as we said, we sort of had a long conversation but couldn't come to an agreement. We finally came to an agreement on the presentation of the work, but the institution needed the approval of the artist to show it, so that conversation ended. In the last year, we did another small project in a museum in Blois in France that was part of a much larger project, and it actually was sort of based on our David Hammons show 5 years later. So it was just a small component of a much larger project. I mean, it wasn't that small, but it was buried in a much larger conceit. And that's really the only other project we've done out. Almost all of our projects have been, Shelly's saying. We did do the Maurizio Cattelan show that we presented in 2009, was represented later at a private foundation in Athens at the Dusty Foundation, and they just basically took the show whole and represented it. We went there and installed it ourselves, but we didn't change the content of the show. It made sense in that context because that foundation was also a major patron of Maurizio Cattelan's. So, and Maurizio Cattelan had seen the show and I think blessed it for the patron. So there weren't issues, even though that show had critical elements.
But I think moreover it has to do with the institutions themselves and their boards and the people who are controlling what happens. I think if there's an institution that's open, and it could have something to do with the country that it's in, it could have something to do with the politics in that country, then it's going to happen. But I think institutions are mostly interested in keeping people happy. So anything that kind of rocks the boat, even potentially, I think is risky for them. I don't think they're used to having people or curators who are supposed to be protecting artists and the artworks come up with something like this. And they do believe it could offend, which is the last thing they want to do. Unless, again, unless you're more progressive in your thinking.
Anybody else have a question or comment?
Yeah. I have a kind of nebulous question or confusion. So I see a lot of rigor in what you do, a lot of cleverness. You're obviously coming from a very educated place, and I wonder if you could say something about if there's also passion and love in your practice and where that is.
I mean, obviously, I don't think we would put ourselves through this, as volunteers for 10 years in an organization and working as hard as we do if we didn't love what we do. I think we love the curatorial field enough to try to find a way to change it and to try to find another avenue, another way into it.
That hasn't necessarily been explored, to open things up more. It's pretty, I would say it's pretty conservative and pretty staid right now. And our interest is And that's, I mean, we love it, and so we're trying to find another door into it.
Yeah, I think one of the things too that, in terms of that passion, it sometimes comes up in conversations, that sort of the standard conversation while you guys are functioning like artists, and we say no, we're curating. We don't self-define as artists, and one of the things that we, by choice, we decide to put this in a curatorial context rather than an artistic context. That's very important to the sort of our thinking and strategy and interest. But also, I think our relationship to the objects that we make. We're literally exhibition makers, and the objects that we make in our shows, we have a very detached relationship to. We don't expect them to be very good. They're sort of serving a purpose. We refer to them as surrogates and props. Most of them get destroyed after a show is down, with a few exceptions of the Cattelan show we mentioned, and one other. But the works either get destroyed or they get taken apart, and elements just get recycled into future shows. So.
What's the passion for the full?
Yeah. So the sort of emotional investment is to the larger conceit rather than at the level of the event or object, I think, is what we would say. Somebody else said it.
So what is your curatorial POV?
What is our curatorial what?
Your point of view.
Oh, point of view. Can you be more specific about what you mean by that?
Well, what are you looking for as a curator?
Well, I mean, what I think aligns the practice of what we're doing with curatorial activity is the fact that first and foremost we're working with subjects outside of ourselves that are artistic, that are grounded in history frequently, almost always, that are coming. We're coming at it from an art historical place often, but in overlaying on it some sort of like an editorial methodology that comes a little bit out of, we haven't talked about this, but comes out of our work in magazine publishing. And I think it's really, for us, it's a way for us to test our own belief systems in the way that history is written, the way that art is defined and given value through history. Those are the things that are really of interest to us.
We talked to the class today about being critical, and the fact that most exhibitions are boosteristic of their subjects. I mean, most of them are, especially, in galleries or museums. The whole idea is to promote the artists that they're presenting. And, for us, it's much more interesting to be honest, or from our perspective as people who look at artwork, and see at times, the problems, the faults, that something isn't necessarily as great as it might be seen, along with what is great.
Or to sort of unpack or critique or to unravel some of the narratives that are drawn around in a body of work, as we did or attempted to do in the Art at Povera show. So, in terms of a curatorial point of view, I think that's probably the best way we could respond to that. Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about the choice of artists that you work with, like with the Nolan show or the Hammons show? It seems a little bit to have to do with maybe access, but I was kind of curious why those particular artists.
Those two artists in particular, and this doesn't have to do with Maurizio because he's very well known and very accessible, but they both are reclusive. They both are very controlling of their work, and they limit access of their work to the public. And they have been very influential on young artists, and there's a lot of desire to see their work and know about their work more. If not young artists, but older artists who haven't seen work of theirs in a museum setting. So.
And I would say particularly we did those shows in late 2005, early 2006, those two shows, the Hammons, Nolan. That was a moment where both those artists, they're both obviously still sort of, they're both significant artists still, no doubt. But at the time, for the previous 5 years before then, from let's say the turn of the millennium to 2005, we were seeing references to their work showing up in the work of a lot of artists. And yet, you still couldn't, because there was no monograph or there'd been no survey of Cady Noland's work, you'd see her work in bits and pieces, a work in a group show here, very few and far between, and sort of putting together this full trajectory of her career up until that point was very difficult to do. So although we were doing it in a bastardized way, we were sort of in an approximated way, we were trying to feed that desire for more information about the sort of arc of her career.
Was that then transitioning more into a critique of the work?
Well, I think the Cattelan project, yes, it was, but also I think in all these cases we have a sort of a word we use often is that we have a profound sort of ambivalence about the work. There's things about the work of the artist that we really respect and we feel an affinity to. In the case of Cattelan, it was like the publications Permanent Food, Charlie, where he was, just taking imagery that's out there in the world and republishing it without permission. Some of his earlier shows where he replicated another artist's work in an adjacent gallery or stole work. There's that side of his work that we really responded to. There's other sides of his work that we were very, responded less to, and I think the sort of what he came to represent in terms of the market was also needling us to some degree.
And we made that, that the difference is that we made that evident in the show. So instead of, like what a museum would do, you just kind of brush that under a rug. We were very clear about when we were very clear when we were being critical of some of the projects that he had been doing.
One other thing I wanted to say that's related to that is the Maurizio show. The approach was rather different. It was the show was about his life and work, because his work is so imbued by autobiographical references. So the approach we took was more anthropological. In general, we were looking sort of at this artist's life and work as one single entity. So the show included, references to personal events in his life, anecdotes, some of the tales that have become part of the overall Cattelan mythology. We presented artifacts that related to these stories. They weren't the actual artifacts, of course, but there's this story that's often repeated of him stabbing a friend when he was in grade school, stabbing a colleague's hand with a pen. So we presented, illustrated that with an actual sculptural recreation of a bloody pen, and in addition to the work. So it felt a little bit like an anthropology, almost history museum when you walked through that show. Yes.
Yeah. So when we talked earlier in class, most of the images that you reproduce are pretty much just straight-on reproductions. What led you to alter the images that you used in the Arte Povera show?
No, go ahead.
There was a couple reasons. One was, the whole basis of our claim was that the evidence was unreliable, and that various people had their hands in the evidence, from Chalant to other curators, in sort of redefining it. And some could say, objectively rewriting the history, and others, you could also say that they were personalizing the history in their own way. So we were making that very explicit by doing that. At least that's how we saw it, and that was some of the it didn't feel as strange to us, though, yes, you're right, a lot of the two-dimensional reproductive work we'd presented before in shows wasn't necessarily altered, except for maybe by scale. But a lot of the sculptural work was in a lot of the shows is wrong, and we've had our hand in it. So it's growing out of that too.
It was also just a really basic level, just a new way of approaching it, too. I mean, I think once you start getting out pens and pencils and start drawing on top of things, it becomes kind of addictive, and you start to see that, you can change this thing, and what does that mean? Yeah. Okay.
It's also a very literal way of bringing the history into the present, so that when the viewer's standing before the object, it's recently manipulated. It's not just sort of this historical document that's referencing back several decades. It's there's an intervention that's very current, and our hope was that would keep people looking.
Could you talk a little bit about the transition from having your own physical space in Harlem, so acting both as curators and perhaps directors to, you know, like now having these two negative experiences where your projects didn't follow through, does that desire to have your own space like in Philadelphia exist, and how are you thinking about that? Or
No, I mean, I think that it's a good question, and the Palais de Tokyo happened probably 3 or 4 years ago, so that wasn't recent. But and we didn't really think of that as negative, and it's strangely enough we don't think of this either as negative. I just want to say that we think of it more as a learning experience. It's just always so interesting to see how people respond, and how people will stand by you and really fight through their issues, and then in the end not be able to handle it. I think that's what we keep coming away with. But not having a space is strange. I mean, we physically worked on shows for 10 years. We loved it. We immersed ourselves in it. I think we're just, you know, trying to figure out a new way of how to keep it going, and we have been, because there have been lots of projects and writing projects and interviews that we've been doing, so we've been really busy with still kind of keeping Triple Candie alive. If we make it into physical form again, I think that would be great. I think we need to think about what it would mean in a new place.
And regarding, you know, just adding on to what Shelly said about not being a disappointment, the last line, fine, was, you know, was end in Italian, so, but also fine in English. So we went through this whole process, and sure, there was moments where we looked at each other, but we just kind of kept forging on, and we figured it, I think from the beginning we thought there was the possibility this may not happen. And at various steps along the way, we thought this may not happen. But it gave us an excuse to do research, and it gave us an excuse to deal with the material. And coming out the other side of it with it canceled, we're fine. We're okay with that. It would have been great to do the show. We would have loved to have done the show, of course. But
we've gotten all this new knowledge on
yeah,
the movement that we wouldn't have before.
had an opportunity or reason to delve into. Yes.
Is this this sort of critical exhibition-making strategy something that you think needs to remain separate from the institutional or museum system, or is it something that you would like to see adopted into that? And if so, maybe what are some institutions that you feel are sort of open enough to take on a strategy like this?
I don't know. I mean, I don't have strong feelings like that it should be absorbed or, you know, become a activity within the museum system. It's sort of, and I think we both understand why it's not there. So, and it brings it back to, I mean, organizations that have very sort of limited oversight and small, you know, their governance is very limited, like ours. We're 2 board members and there's 1 other board member. Has a little bit more freedom to do these sort of things. Of course, you don't have any money, but you have that freedom. And so, I don't know. In terms of it sort of changing the way institutions think or work or function, I don't know. I think if there was other smaller spaces and more of this type of activity out there, that would be exciting to us, because we'd see how other people would do it. And, you know, they're
I mean, I think that would be great if institutions were more critical, definitely. I mean, personally. But again, it would take a huge change in thinking about, you know, the reasons for being. And I can't think of I don't know, Jens, can you think of an exhibition space that could kind of tackle more critical?
like an established institutional context.
Well, I mean, I think there's certainly a lot of like very critical curatorial practice that is taking place, but maybe not as much here in the US as you might find it in Europe, where there has been a certain appropriation of institutional critique into the curatorial context happening that you don't really see here that much. I'm thinking perhaps also about artists working as curators when I think about it. You know, something like Andrea Fraser, for example, comes to mind, I suppose. But I think also in your particular practice, it's a certain particular way of being critical. You know, you're not like being critical in regards to the institution or the art system, or I mean, for some reason or another, you have made yourself a field there by focusing on these projects mostly around artists. I think this show that was planned to be taking place in Torino would have been like the first one that would have taken on an art movement, but in a sort of similar vein, sort of like critically, sort of with a humorous twist perhaps, looking at this material. So I think it's a kind of extremely unique curatorial practice, and I wouldn't necessarily see how anybody else would be able to adopt that or do that. You know, and I feel the same like with my way of working as a curator. You know, you find your niche because it sort of suits you, and it's like what, you know, it represents where you're coming from and who you are, and your involvement and interest in the art world. But what you do, of course, in my eyes, is, you know, it's an extreme step. It's an extreme gesture, because of course the artist is always holy and the artwork is always holy. This is like the first thing that you basically learn when you go to you know, to university and you're taught art history, and you have to have this respect. And in many ways, I suppose it's probably a good way to begin with that. And then perhaps, you know, through some thinking come to another end, or not, it depends. But you know, I mean, I personally have been criticized and attacked and God knows what for using artists' work to illustrate ideas and And of course, when you talk to the artists, no one has any complaint. It's mostly other curators who have an issue with that, less the artists so. But in your case, it's, you know, like 2 or 3 universes further. And I don't know if that's maybe interesting just to sort of like see how artists, you know, what was David Hammons' reaction? What was Cady Noland saying? Or how other artists reacted to that? I mean, Maurizio, of course, himself being a trickster and a jokester, and you know, you mentioned before the Caribbean Biennial, which was also, you know, an event that wasn't actually a real biennial, whatever that might mean. But anyway, yeah, perhaps it would be nice to hear what reactions you got from artists in general, how they feel about it, and maybe also from Cady Noland and David Hammons. Because those guys are so controlling that I wouldn't be surprised that they would try to block it with legal means.
We talked about this in the class today too. So because it's interesting, because everybody had a different response. Our subjects, when we took on a subject of an individual artist, every single one of them was different. David Hammons never came to the show. He sent his dealers and his daughter to see it, who all came up to us to talk to us about it, and they seemed to really be intrigued by the whole idea of doing of the show. But also, as an aside to the David Hammons show, after it opened, we came outside to find this what are they called, like beanbag? Sitting outside of our door, and we kind of feel like that was a gesture from him. We don't feel like he was angry. We feel like he might have felt like we were stepping on his territory, because for a while after we did the show, it was people were thinking and writing and talking about the fact that they believed that he was behind the show, and I think we let that kind of go on for a while, although he wasn't. And I think he kind of enjoyed that ride, but he never talked to us. Cady Noland was really mad. And we didn't hear this from her, but we heard this from tons of different people who came into the gallery. Lynn Cook, who was then the director of DIA, cornered us in the gallery and was furious, you know, saying, how can we do this to her? And part of, against her wishes, part of it with Cady Noland is that she is known amongst her friends to be very mentally fragile. I mean, we had an idea about this, but we didn't know that. We didn't, and there our question was, you know, well, are we supposed to be considering this? But we had people, Amy Silman, if you guys know who she is, she like has refused to talk to us. She called that gesture anti-feminist. And there have been a number of other people that saw that show. Roberta Smith from the Times said that she thought that it seemed mean-spirited. She came in and talked to us directly about it, and we told her that was not the case. But so the reaction to the Noland show was very different than the Hammons show. Part of it was explained, Roberta Smith explained that the crossover from two-dimensional to three-dimensional was too great a leap in terms of being able to see something as not real. Maurizio, as Jensa said, came to see the show. He was the only one who did. And because he has such a great sense of humor and can laugh at himself, and saw the critical remarks that we had made about him right there in the exhibition, he still thought it was great. He wanted to save it, and his only question was, why did we kill him? Matthew Higgs, as we were saying in the class today, people bring it up all the time with him in lectures. What's the deal with your Matthew Higgs Society? This is so great. Who put this together, and how are you involved? And and it's just very annoying for him to have to deal with this, because in theory it's not, it's yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, the Higgs project is, although we sort of maniacally, like maniacs, not maniacally, assembled everything we could find on him, all his writing, all the issues of WC from White Columns, the zine there, everything we could find, images of him out in public. We had people taking pictures of him out there that we didn't ask, but they knew about it, so they'd take pictures of him at openings and they'd send them in to us. And so we tried to create as much as pure and as deep a document of him as an artist, as an administrator, as a curator, as we could. And we kept all this stuff open in the reading room. But but Matthew never came by. And
I think he sees this as
we're probably annoying to him. We're not, it's not meant to be, we're not doing it to be annoying to him, but it probably is a little annoying to him. We've never actually met him. We've sort of deliberately all of our subjects generally, with the exception of Maurizio, who came in and we couldn't not meet him because he was right there. We try not to meet generally. So even though we've been in similar rooms with Matthew, we've tried not to meet him. Though he may not really want to meet us.
I guess to a certain extent, this is kind of just and maybe I'm wrong in saying this. This is kind of an inside baseball. I'm kind of curious to what extent a gallery goer who's not savvy to these kind of conversations and curation would walk away. And maybe I'm just
okay. So this all of our projects were sort of conceived for the 10 years we were in Harlem to be about what it meant to have an alternative space in New York, A, at that time, B, to be a gallery in Harlem, C, to be a gallery in Harlem run by white people. We were dealing with these things all the time. And, what we learned in the process of being there and curating, we lived near the gallery as well, was that when we shifted our model over, people were more engaged with it than they were when we were showing art. We didn't lose any audience. In fact, I think we might have gained audience. There's probably a number of reasons, but the work by itself just feels less precious, so it's less about, here's this contemporary art gallery in the neighborhood that's gentrifying the neighborhood, oh shit, what's happening? So it didn't strike fear in people, so they felt more comfortable being there. There's a heavy use of text in a lot of the shows. It's become, again, I think in part influenced by our magazine work, but a lot of the shows, like Maurizio, was heavily text-based. A lot of the shows have very, very long or a heavy use of text panels. So there's strong narrative element there that I think also is a point of access for people that may not be of an art background. Ironically, we were surprised and emboldened, and it was great that it didn't in any way, it didn't turn out to be a negative. Yeah.
Back to the thing about how the subjects that you curate feel about what you do. I get the sense that that's sort of not something that you that you either want to take or do take into consideration a lot. And I wonder if, I guess I just wonder, you know, if you have, like, how that works with you, if there's, like, you know, great anxiety about it, or if you just totally are able to put it aside, or if it's,
I think we have to remove ourselves from that, and that's why like we don't like to meet artists. I think if we wouldn't be able to do the show if we knew them. I think that's and so I think it's important. I don't think we knew that at the beginning. I think that was something that we kind of learned over time. And yeah, no, we don't. I think that we've come to the point where, you know, that isn't a consideration, and it's really not a part of, that's really not what the show's about.
And that's probably a little bit in coming to our masters are in art history. So, you know, dealing with work at a great distance, dealing with a lot of historical subjects that may be deceased and you may not have access to anyways. And so sort of treating all subjects as though they're deceased and inaccessible to you.
In reality, we're talking about a pretty minuscule community of a lot of people who are alive and know each other, and I just,
Sure. Yeah,
just
minuscule and elite, and yeah, and we're outside of it. Yeah.
Could you maybe talk about your relationship? I mean, you mentioned your magazine work, but your relationship to your writing, the writing in the show, and then how that translates. You said you've been doing interviews and stuff since then and been busy. And if you have ever wanted to pursue any of your curatorial projects through other means besides an in-person exhibition.
I think we like the whole process of making an exhibition, from research to having it take physical form, that it's hard for us to ultimately imagine it translating to another form. We never did any publications in the 10 years that we curated shows. We never, ever, there was never, except for the Hammons catalog, which was basically reproductions of the reproductions on the walls and then some represented old interviews. But we never really, that was never part of it. And I think a lot of that sort of thinking about making print-based publications has informed the practice. So I think we feel like all four of our feet are so firmly in a spatial environment that I'm not sure that we would substitute. We can't imagine substituting it right now.
But we do like the format of print to be able to keep continuing, you know, getting our word out, or whatever, our philosophy, through interviews and through writing, because, I mean, that's something we love to do. We do, I mean, it's part of Triple Candie, but it's also a separate, because it's not exhibition, so it's a separate endeavor, if that makes sense.
Could you talk about your name?
The name, we were living on in Northwest Harlem when Triple Candie, when we started Triple Candie, and across the street from our house, a residence, our apartment, was a bodega called Triple Candie. It was spelled Triple Candie, C-A-N-D-Y, and it was just a typical sort of candy store, except for that it really wasn't. It was, you know, fronting as a drug sales, whatever. And it went out of business right around the time that we were starting Triple Candie, and we were looking for a name, and we really wanted to find something that was, for us, anchored in Harlem and local. So we co-opted the name, changed it to IE, and we went over there and told them, and they gave us their sign. So we had their sign for a long time. And we like, you know, triple's the best, triple crown, triple washed, triple play. And we liked Candie, that it sounded just so innocuous and sweet. And I think that...
Great, thank you very much.